السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. هنكمل تفكر وفي أنفسكم أفلا تبصرون. هنكمل السنترال نيرفس سيستم. احنا خدنا النيرفس سيستم عموما، خدنا الجهاز العصبي ازاي بيتحكم، ازاي هو المايسترو سبحان الله، ازاي ربنا يعني جعل لنا كده خدامين ببلاش بيخدمونا وانت نايم، وانت رئتك بتشتغل، اعضائك بتشتغل، نفسك، المعدة، الهضم، كل ده شغال من غير ما انت تحس. حاجة زي involuntary، حاجة لا إرادية. عارفين ردود الفعل لا إرادية؟ كل دي أكن ربنا جايب لك شغالين عندك يشتغلوا بدون ما انت تحس، بدون ما انت تتعب، بدون ما انت تقوم هضم الأكل تشتغل عشان لا، يعني سبحان الله كل ده شغال بدون ما انت تتعب. طيب تعالوا بقى نقسمهم. احنا عندنا السمباثيك وقلنا عندنا ايه الباراسمباثيك. الفرق بين السمباثيك والباراسمباثيك ان عندك الباراسمباثيك البوست جانجليونيك بتاعها طويل، لكن السمباثيك معلش البري جانجليونيك ريسبتور بتبقى قريب من السباينال كورد في السمباثيك، لكن بيبقى ايه، بيبقى بعيد في الباراسمباثيك عشان على مهله بقى عقبال ما بيوصل للاورجن عادي. طيب لو بصينا في الصورة هنا هنلاقي عندنا البرين والسباينال كورد، وعندنا اللي هو الايه السوماتيك اللي هو بتاع المسلز، اللي هي الفولانتري، الحاجه بقى اللي انا بتحكم فيها. انا هرفع ايدي، انا هنزل ايدي، دي الحاجه اللي انا بتحكم فيها. لكن احنا بنتكلم بقى الاوتونوميك ده انا مسمياه اللي هو شغل فنادق، حاجه كده جايه لك من غير ما انت تشتغل فيها، حاجه كده بتتعمل لا ارادي سبحان الله. عندك الباراسمباثيك وعندك السمباثيك. طيب تعالوا نشوف، ناخد صورة تانية بقى بالتفصيل عن الاورجنز اللي بيوصل لها ازاي الايه السمباثيك والباراسمباثيك. بصوا شايفين هنا النيرفز خارجة ازاي سبحان الله بدقة غريبة، وعايزين نشوف فيديو يورينا برضو ايه، حاجة بقى 4D او كده. المفروض ان المنطقة الثوراسيك دي هي بتاعة الاعصاب بتاعة الايه السمباثيك نيرفس سيستم، هتلاقيها رايحة للاورجنز المهمة زي اللنج، الليفر، الانتستين، الستومك. وخلي بالكم النيرفس اللي هي اللي رايحه في نيرفس سيستم خاص بالانتريك اللي هو الابدومين وكده، اسمه انتريك نيرفس سيستم. الانتريك نيرفس سيستم ده ماله؟ ده واصل له سمباثيك وباراسمباثيك الاتنين. طب تفتكروا سبحان الله كده السمباثيك في الانتريك نيرفس سيستم بيشتغل على الكونتراكشن ولا على الريلاكسيشن؟ دقة لا نهائية سبحان الله القدير، يعني خلق كل شيء بقدر. هتلاقوا ان السمباثيك بيعمل كونتراكشن في حتة السفنكترز عشان يقفل، اللي هو انا مش في وسط الخناقة، في وسط الامتحان راح اعمل بيبيه. لكن في المسلز بيعمل لها ايه ريلاكسيشن، عشان المسلز لو حصل لها كونتراكشن في المعدة وفي الامعاء انا كده هخش الحمام، لكن لما بتريلاكس انا كده مش هخش الحمام. فسبحان الله في كل عضلة وصل لها اللي يناسب بيها في الوقت ده، يعني حاجة يعني سبحان الله بجد. طيب بالنسبة لي سبحان الله الجونادز والحاجات اللي واصلة للريكتال والحاجات اللي واصلة للجانجل والبلفيك، كل ده وصل له حاجات سمباثيك، حاجات بره سمباثيك اكتر. ليه؟ لان الحاجات اللي هي مسؤولة عن السكريشنز، المسؤولة عن السكشوال سكريشنز، المسؤولة عن كل ده بتحتاج الباراسمباثيك، بتحتاج الدنيا الهادية، بتحتاج الكلام ده كله. فسبحان الخالق والله. يا دودو، سبحان الخالق، يعني كل حاجة بقدر، وكل حاجة علشان تناسب وقتك. يعني الموضوع مش قصة أعضاء متركبة ومتركبة في بعضها خلاص، لا ده كل عضو سبحان الله عشان يناسب. يعني يا دودو تعالى اما نسألك دلوقتي، لو انت متخانق وهتروح تجري ورا الكلب والكلب بيجري وراك، هيشتغل الجهاز العصبي بتاع الايه، بتاع اللي انت تتحرك بسرعة ولا بتاع اللي انت تهدى وتنام براحتك؟ ايه رأيك؟ ربنا هيشغل لك انهي جهاز في مخك، اللي هو بيخليك تتحرك بسرعة السمباثيك، ولا اللي بيخليك بقى تبقى على مهلك السمباثيك يا روحي؟ لكن الجهاز التاني ده لما نبقى نكون قاعدين ايه براحتنا. طيب في حاجه كمان عايزه اقول لكم عليها. احنا كده خدنا الانتريك نيرفس سيستم، وعرفنا ان هو فيه سمباثيك، وعرفنا ان فيه باراسمباثيك. كمان عايزه اقول لكم على انواع معينه من النيرفز. في عندنا افرنت نيرف، في عندنا افرنت نيرف. الافرنت اللي هو اللي طالع، او اللي هو الايه اللي طالع اللي هو مثلًا اللي هو الsensory nerves اللي هي إيه، هتشعر لي بالحاجات وكده. المفروض إن الsympathetic nerves اللي هي واصلة للأمعاء دي بتشتغل بتحس بإيه، بتحس بtemperature، بتحس بinjury، بتحس بالحاجات المهمة. عشان كده بيقول لك اللي بيشرب مَيّة ساقعة ده كده بيشغّل الجهاز الsympathetic مش بيشغّل الparasympathetic، فده بيبقى في خطر شديد جدًا إن ييجي له بعد الشر heart attack أو sudden heart attack أو كده. بالذات لو هو عنده إيه، عنده genetic factors كمان بتحفّز كده. فالأمعاء برضه واصل لها sympathetic مش واصل لها parasympathetic بس لأ، واصل لها sympathetic بس بيحس بحاجات معيّنة. كمان في حاجة تانية، الpain مش بيحس بيه سبحان الله، لو عندك pain مش بيحس بيه اللي هو الsympathetic لأ، ده أنت بتحس بيه في الparasympathetic. عشان كده سبحان الله بيقول لِك اللي هو إيه ده أنا إزاي الحزن ما خلّانيش أحس بالوجع أو الصدمة أو ما خلّتنيش أحس بالوجع. يعني سبحان الخلق، يعني خلق كل شيء فعلًا بقدر يعني سبحان الله. طيب إحنا ممكن نبُص على إيه كمان، نبُص على دي ممكن تكون أوضح شوية، دي اللي رايحة للlungs. طيب استني ممكن أشوف لكم حاجة أوضح. sympathetic parasympathetic عايزين حاجة كده 4D موريانا الإيه. ممكن نشوف حاجة 4D innervations sympathetic and parasympathetic innervations. تعالى أوريك حاجة يا دودو. دي control of heart by parasympathetic nerves. احنا عايزين نشوف الايه الsympathetic ده nervous system.
Hey guys, you gotta keep in mind that sometimes life is a better idea. Things might not go our way, and you get thrown an action potential across its axon. When we cover a lot of things, we think it's important to recap. So we've talked about the peripheral nervous system, PNS, and the central nervous system, CNS. Since the CNS involves the spinal cord and brain, we also talked about major areas of the brain. Then we focused on the PNS. How glial cells are, it's time. And if I had to pick my favorite specialized body cell, it'd be a neuron. And if I had to pick my favorite specialized body cell, it'd be a neuron, a cell that is part of the nervous system, the system that is the topic of this video. But before we talk about neurons or other cells in the nervous system, let's give a little general tour of the nervous system. Then we'll get to the cells of the nervous system and briefly mention the action potential. First, structure-wise, you can divide the nervous system into two very general regions: the central nervous system, CNS, which consists of the brain and spinal cord, and peripheral nervous system, PNS, which consists of all other components of the nervous system, such as nerves throughout the body. The PNS can provide sensory information for the CNS. While the CNS can process that information and act as a command center, the CNS can...
الأعصاب اللي في الأطراف دي بتنقل الإشارات اللي توديها لمين؟ للمخ. والمخ يجي يقول لها إيه، اعملي كذا، ارفعي إيديكي، نزلي رجليكي، اشتغلي يا معدة، ما تشتغليش يا معدة.
execute motor responses or regulate body mechanisms. So we said the CNS consisted of the spinal cord and brain. Let's talk a little bit about the amazing human brain. Although realize we're being very general here, as we're going to divide it into three general regions: the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. Let's look at the hindbrain first. It includes the medulla, pons, and cerebellum. The medulla has many regulation functions, such as the regulation of breathing, blood pressure, and heart rate. The pons is involved with some of these functions as well, and also coordinating signals with this area to the rest of the brain. And the cerebellum Balance and movement coordination are some
مسؤولة عن
functions of the
الدخن.
cerebellum. The midbrain, deep in the brain, this area is involved in alertness and the sleep-wake cycle, motor activity,
دي
and
مسؤولة
more.
عن النوم
If
أو
you've heard the term
الانتباه.
brainstem, this includes some of the structures we just mentioned, the medulla, pons, and midbrain specifically. Finally, the forebrain. Most notably, this includes the cerebrum, which itself is divided into two hemispheres, right and left. So many functions are done by our amazing cerebrum depending on specific location, whether it's our speech, our thinking and reasoning, our sensing, our emotions. Check out the further reading to explore this. The forebrain also technically includes some structures in it, like the thalamus, which is involved with sensory and motor information, and hypothalamus, which, if you remember from our endocrine system video, has major control of the endocrine system. There are a lot of myths about the brain. One quick myth I heard all the time as a kid that I have to put to rest. It's the myth that humans only use 10% of their brain. It's not correct. We have a great reading suggestion on that, as well as some others that circulate around. Now, that was all part of the central nervous system. What about the peripheral nervous system? Function-wise, we can further divide the PNS based on what it does. The somatic nervous system, SNS, and autonomic nervous system, ANS. The SNS is involved with motor functions of skeletal muscle. This will include voluntary actions under conscious control, but also somatic reflexes that involve skeletal muscle. The ANS is all about what's going on in the internal environment in regard to gastrointestinal or excretory or endocrine or smooth or cardiac muscle, and it also includes autonomic reflexes. And the ANS itself can be further divided. I know, there's a lot of dividing, but stay with me. The ANS can be divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. The sympathetic system, the shorter word of the two, helps you remember it's part of the quick fight or flight response. I know the whole running from a bear is a very popular example. For me, it'd be more relevant if I was face-to-face with my personal nemesis, the copy machine, which I may or may not have had some very bad experiences with before, and the bell that just rang so you know you have 60 seconds to get your copies, but it's making crazy machine noises and giving you vague warnings. This could also activate your fight or flight response, a response that can cause your heart to race and breathing rate to increase and some things to not be as active, like the digestive system, because if you're desperately trying to run from a bear or take on the copy machine, you don't really need to be digesting food at that moment, right? The parasympathetic system, longer word, this is often called rest and digest. Heart rate will decrease, digestion will occur, again, rest and digest. Many times these two systems can therefore have opposite effects on the same organ. So let's talk about two major types of cells in the nervous system that makes up nervous tissue. That means these are cells that you'll find in the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Most of the time, neurons are what come to mind. There are different types of neurons, but to focus on general neuron structure, you have the cell body, nucleus, and most organelles are here. There are dendrites. Generally, these branch structures are where signals are received. And you have the axon. I like to think away axon because axons are the fiber where normally a signal will be carried away to some other cell. The junction area where the neuron will be communicating with another cell is called a synapse. And the other major cell type? Glial cells, or you can call them glia. When I was a student and read that they were supporting cells, I don't think the word supporting emphasized to me at the time how essential they really are. Structurally, there was a lot of emphasis on how they actually help the neurons connect in place. The word glia comes from a Greek word that means glue, but glia have huge roles, and they are so much more than that. Some glial cells keep a balance of certain chemicals in the space between cells, essential for signaling, and maintain the blood-brain barrier, which keeps a lot of substances in the body from getting into the nervous system. Some glial cells make myelin, which goes around the axons of neurons as something called a myelin sheath. It insulates the axon and the transferring of the signal. Some glial cells produce cerebrospinal fluid, which is protective to the brain and essential for homeostasis, as well as many other critical functions. Some glial cells have important immune function in the nervous system. These are all just a few examples. As amazing as glial cells are, it's time to move on to the action potential. Generally, action potentials are recognized as something neurons do, but we did link some interesting reads about certain glial cell types in action potentials. The main idea is that neurons need to be able to communicate with each other. And to do that, they've got to be able to receive a signal in the dendrite and carry it down the axon. And they need to do that fast, like less than 2 milliseconds fast. The action potential makes that possible.
We can't talk about an action potential without talking about what the neuron is at rest, meaning when there is no signal being carried, at rest, a neuron has something called a resting potential. The resting potential of a neuron is more negative than its surroundings. In fact, it can be measured. It's generally around negative 70 MV. Yes, MV, which is millivolts, it has an electrical charge. That's because there are ions involved, inside and outside of the cell. Ions like chloride, sodium, potassium, certain anions, specifically sodium Na+, and potassium K+, play huge roles in keeping the resting potential. They should sound familiar because we talked about the sodium-potassium pump in another video, and that is a pump that helps maintain a neuron at resting potential. At rest, generally the sodium concentration, Na+, is higher outside of the cell, and the potassium K+ concentration is higher inside the cell. How can we remember that? How about it's cool to be K+ resting in the cell, but overall at rest, the neuron is more negative inside compared to its surroundings. So, let's say the dendrite of the neuron receives a signal. This can generate an action potential along the axon. An action potential is going to rapidly change the charge in the neuron along the axon. The signal carries from one area of the axon to the next. Ion channels open, allowing Na+ to flood inside the first region of the axon. Recall Na+ is a positive ion. This event is called depolarization, as the electric charge is becoming more positive in the axon as Na+ floods in, and most K+ channels at that moment stay closed. This spreads to the next region of the axon and carries along. As the action potential spreads to a new region of the axon, the old region where the action potential already occurred will start to be restored back. To learn more about the different channels that open and close to achieve this amazing feat, or specific events like the undershoot or refractory period, check out the further reading links in the video description. Eventually, we hope to have an entire video on this process. Two things to point out about the action potential. Number one, if neurons are myelinated, meaning they have myelin sheaths that insulate the axon and assist with the transfer of the signal, the action potential can actually jump from node to node, the nodes being areas where it's not myelinated. And number two, important to realize, the action potential is considered an all or none thing. What we mean by that is either it happens or it doesn't. It's like a light switch. It's on or it's off. There isn't a dimmer switch. There aren't different levels. It's either off or it reaches the threshold of when it's on, and if it's on, it's going. So that's all good, but what happens next? Let's say you have an action potential and it's going to signal another neuron. Now what? Well, that's one way to introduce neurotransmitters. So the action potential goes down the axon and gets to the axon terminals, the ends of the axon. We had mentioned about the synapse, where both of these neurons can communicate. The action potential can signal synaptic vesicles in that neuron to release something called neurotransmitters. There are different types of neurotransmitters, and they can be derived from different substances, for example, amino acids or amino acid precursors, or even a gas such as nitric oxide, although the release is a little different than other neurotransmitters. Generally, when neurotransmitters are released from the synaptic vesicles, the transmitters only need to travel a small space between the neurons, specified as the synaptic cleft. Then they can bind specific receptors of the next neuron, specific receptors to the type of neurotransmitter that binds it. The dendrite area of the other neuron receives the signal and can start an action potential across its axon. When we cover a lot of things, we think it's important to recap. So we've talked about the peripheral nervous system, PNS, and the central nervous system, CNS. Since the CNS involves the spinal cord and brain, we also talked about major areas of the brain. Then we focused on the PNS, how it can be divided into the somatic nervous system, SNS, and autonomic nervous system, ANS. And then how the autonomic nervous system, ANS, can be divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. We then explored major cell types in the nervous system, glial cells and neurons, and since neurons can communicate with each other using an action potential, we gave a brief overview of the action potential. We then mentioned that once the action potential occurs, this can signal the release of neurotransmitters in the synapse between neurons. Those neurotransmitters bind specific receptors of a neighboring neuron. Whew! So with such a complex system that could be so many videos long, there continues to be a lot of research done to help diseases and conditions of the nervous system. If you have an interest in this field, there are many